Welcome to The Power of One. My name is Brian Berry and I'm your host. This is a program that can show you that one person makes a difference and that there are many people in our community who do that every day. Today my guest is Pablo Miralles, a local documentary filmmaker and creative person who has recently completed a film called Why or Can We All Get Along? The Segregation of John Muir High School. So thank you very much for being here today. It's really a pleasure to have you in the studio.
Thank you.
So first of all, I just wanted to get a little bit of background, who you are, what you're doing. How do you spend your days these days?
Well, the film was finished last year, 2019, and this is my year to try to promote the film, independently distribute the film, which is a model that didn't really exist for films up until a couple of years ago. I'm also a full-time dad. I have an 11-year-old who will be starting in Pasadena Unified School District in the fall.
Great.
And so independent filmmaker, dad, those are my two primary titles.
Great. So you and I both grew up in Pasadena, and I wanted to know from your perspective, what was your experience growing up in Pasadena?
Well, I should preface that by saying I actually grew up in Altadena, but it's similar.
Well,
it's
similar. The Altadena people will understand
it's where the sidewalk
process.
ends.
Yes.
Okay.
And the parking begins.
That's right, exactly. No, I grew up with a large family, immigrant parents, in a primarily African American neighborhood, and I really cannot imagine a better childhood. We're close to hiking trails, part of a very a school district that had just recently been desegregated the year before. One of the reasons I think we were able to move to this large house in Altadena was because the large white family had decided they didn't want to be bused. So,
so that's really interesting. You're in some ways a direct result of the desegregation story.
That's right. I think so. That's sort of been the impression that I've always received. But regardless, it was it was a close-knit middle class African American primarily neighborhood, but there were other whites. There was Japanese Americans and what we were considered Mexican Americans, not a lot of south of the border, right, other than Mexican at the time. And Altadena, as a melting pot of middle class and especially a lot of artistic people, I think really helped my impression of what a community should be. I never felt comfortable unless I was in a real diverse community like that.
Yeah, and I think when we travel around the country, we go to places that are less diverse, immediately we sense a difference. We recognize kind of almost viscerally the lack of diversity or absence of. So with that kind of an upbringing, and I feel the same way, certainly through the Pasadena Unified School District, I had a similar experience. How would you say that those surroundings have influenced you as an artist?
Well, I think as an artist, I think one of the things is you learn to appreciate different ideas of what is. Immediately I turned to music. My parents, middle class immigrants who were into classical music, but I grew up listening primarily to R&B and funk because that's what my friends on the street were listening to. So an appreciation for music that other people might say, oh, that's the other's music. No, that can be my music too, as well as the folk rock of my older brothers and sisters, as well. And so the diversity of acceptance of what other people are listening to or watching or appreciating. It's an appreciation for something that maybe doesn't necessarily belong to my immediate culture, but I can definitely become a part of within a community.
Yeah, and that kind of leads to a melting pot doesn't necessarily happen organically, or certainly there are challenges or hurdles that people go through as they figure out the relationships within that community. It sounds like music is one way that can bring people together. What would you say are some other ways, some other sort of mechanisms by which we can help people to understand each other.
Wow, that's a very multi-layered question. I think if you just start with the idea of how do you make a diverse community, and I think the United States has had a very pained history trying to find out a way to do this on a large scale. I think West Altadena, where I grew up, had deep roots of an abolitionist movement, people that came here, like Owen Brown, the son of John Brown.
Right, John Brown.
And because it was in the county and not the city, there were not those covenants that restricted housing. Redlining wasn't as prevalent. So like a great story that I think represents how I see it is that it's an inclusionary community. No one is turned away, regardless of your race primarily in the old days, but I think now if you go into the west side of Pasadena and a lot of Altadena, there's still an acceptance, whether it's same-sex couples having children. I don't think there's those kind of the community is accepting, and a lot of the surrounding communities you don't always get that feeling like and so how does that get started? Well, I think it's like I said, roots. The original people were inclusionary. If you start in like South Pasadena, where they started with an exclusionary philosophy, right? Then I think it's been a lot harder to create a truly diverse community. And I think though I was lucky that way. I didn't know I was lucky that way until I went to college. But definitely now that I look back and I think about moving back here this year with my son, it's one of the things I want to be part of his DNA as well, to be part of this inclusive, artistic, nature-friendly, environmental-friendly community because I think this century is going to be a challenge on all those fronts.
Yeah. So from your perspective, you really believe that people can get along?
Absolutely. I've lived it.
Yeah.
It was a rhetorical question.
Yeah. So follow me here.
Okay.
There are a lot of folks who look back on the 70s in a way, the desegregation, everything from Brown versus Board of Education, and they feel as though that was the beginning of the decline, especially within the school district. But I lived it as well. And so I wanted to know from your perspective, what was it like, bringing all these cultures together and bringing together that diversity, and then bumping up against one another on occasion?
Well, I think from my perspective, and probably yours as well, as children are the most accepting of all human beings. Yeah. They haven't yet had these strong negative, generally, feelings about other people based simply on their skin color. So that's one of the reasons I feel very lucky. And because we were a group that all went through it together, we didn't have any of the perhaps traumatic experiences of the earlier generation. But I will say, 99 out of 100 people that say, oh, that was a negative experience, I will have to say we're either very privileged or very white. Because we are in the United States. And the United States has very strong white privilege and systems, both legal and cultural, that are designed to maintain power. So anything that happens, starting, for example, with the board of Brown and the board, and then years later with the civil rights movement.
Yeah, it was a Judge Manuel Real decision.
Yes. Well, Brown and the board was 57. Then finally, 7 years later, they got the civil rights law that allowed other school districts outside of the South, because it's easy to desegregate schools where it's a de jure decision that there's a law that says whites go to this school, blacks go to that school. Okay, that's obvious racism. Yeah. But in places like Pasadena, the first city outside of the South that was federally mandated, it was a de facto segregation. And in New York City today, that's the real issue, is that they're the most segregated school district, public school district, in what is considered by many the most liberal city. So,
and one of the most diverse cities on the planet.
That's true. So how do those systems happen? Why was it that in Pasadena, for example, when you do talk to someone who said it was a terrible experience, most of the time I can pretty much guess what part of the city they came from, where it was a challenge for them, versus in my neighborhood, it was, seen as a wonderful opportunity. So.
Yeah, and let me push on that a little bit. Not just that it was the experience in and of itself at that time, but what's happened since then. So, and this kind of, I want to get into the film and why you would ever do that and what you hope to accomplish. But it seems like a lot of people feel like that moment was a watershed moment where it actually has created more division than harmony. What would you say to that?
I would disagree. I would say prior to the busing, a black family living on the east side of Lake was rare to the extreme. Within a couple of years, there were far more black families moving over there because the fact that their neighborhood school wasn't going to be exclusively white anymore anyway, and then also a lot of people leaving, opening up real estate. So just in terms of Pasadena, Altadena, still to this day is one of the most diverse communities in Southern California. It has definitely demographically changed because of the financial situation, but that's another topic.
Yeah, the economics.
Yeah, the economics is regardless, but we're talking about in the 70s especially. Why the second half of your question is mainly about, well, has it become worse? And I think that wasn't just a Pasadena, Altadena situation of why it got worse. In the late 70s, the conservative movement in the United States used the resentment of white middle class primarily, especially Southerners, who felt like they were forced to do something they didn't want to do, and started this government is bad. It was bloomed during the Reagan 8 years.
Yeah.
And so first you had government is bad, and then the change in the philosophy of our community as a nation. There was a time, and we call them the greatest generation, where everybody felt that they all worked together to solve big problems, the Depression, the World War II. But when the Civil Rights movement came along, it wasn't about making it better for everybody. It was about making it better for the minorities, right? And in my opinion, the backlash to that, which started really in earnest in the 80s, is that we became a country that was less about what was good for everybody is good for me, and more about what's good for me is good for everybody. And when I look at schools in Pasadena, and I talk to parents who have chosen a private school or charter school because, look at the test scores. Well, the test scores have nothing to do with your experience your child is going to have in that school, but it does probably have a lot to say with the socioeconomics of the average student. And that, by the way, also correlates to race because we have failed. We never lived up to the goals of our civil rights movement because we became a more selfish country in that regard.
Yeah, so then let's focus a little bit on the film and its genesis. So again, a lot of people, especially with the current administration, would say, well, you know what, we're still butting heads, and there's a very, very conservative aspect of our society that is deeply ingrained in not only our history and our mythology, but then also in our current political structure. So how does film, how does art, how does that help us to think a little bit differently about the context in which we live?
Well, I mean, I'm someone who really believes in historical perspective. I was sort of like who I am. My favorite classes in school were history classes. And I also am a huge fan of personal stories. The genesis of this film was that in 2011, I was invited by my friend Cameron Turner, who is really the voice and soul of the film, an African American.
He's a major part of it.
Yeah, who said, we were just talking about, I forgot, it was Ferguson or something of that nature was happening. And I said, it's so weird because while we were in school, this felt like something that wasn't going to happen anymore. And yet it seems to be happening, and it was happening with more and more frequency. And we would talk about how lucky we were to go to school in Pasadena and Altadena in the 70s and early 80s under full court order, desegregation. So I went to a planning committee of his 30th John Muir High School reunion, and I looked across this table at Mijares Mexican restaurant at this amazing diversity. And I realized at that moment that not since I had left Muir had I been in a group that was as diverse as that, right? And so I made a very short 10-minute film of just that group.
Oh, wait. Just to
This
clarify.
is the genesis of this. That was another film.
So, okay,
This was
separate.
just like, I was curious because I was in the middle of post-production on my previous feature film, and I had spare time because I wasn't the editor. So I did it, and the reaction to that film was like, oh my God, we were so lucky. Why isn't things like this today? And that
Right.
question of why has it changed started me on this Can We All Get Along, which at the time was called Stories of Integration from John Muir High School, because I wanted to highlight our generation. But it only took a couple of days of research at the History Museum in Pasadena, at the Alumni Museum at Muir, talking to former students who were before busing and current students who are after. In these pre-interviews, I realized, no, this is not about my generation. Yeah, we were lucky, but it was a window. There was a really interesting history of John Muir previous, where it was the only integrated school within 20 miles. And then there's a really interesting fact that now it's become a average, segregated, failing public high school. And these are all, I'm using quotes because I don't believe those things, but that's what people perceive.
Yeah, we want to make sure that those are sort of memes or those are places that or assumptions that people make.
Yes,
that are not proven.
They're false perceptions, but they're very prevalent.
Yes.
And I was constantly running up against older alumni who would say, well, I wouldn't send my child there.
Right.
And so so first I made
But why not? What do they say?
Why not? Well, there's a perception that it's failing. And one of the things that I feel happened, and I've done enough research to feel like it's actually true, there was an accountability, accountability movement in public education. It started with these articles during the time when we thought Japanese were going to take over the country in the 70s, that they were better students. They had higher test scores, right? Higher test scores, they're going to be better than us, right? Well, we have to make sure that our kids learn all their math and science, and we're going to make accountability as important. And so these school reforms started that said, well, our kids are doing too much extracurriculars. The teachers aren't trained well enough. It's the union's fault because the unions are keeping bad teachers from being fired. And there were all these excuses as to why our schools weren't doing well. When in reality, we were still the greatest economy. We still were producing the greatest artists, perhaps, and definitely the greatest amount of like Nobel Prize winners and all these other things. It was this paranoia of falling behind. And so in my opinion, that eventually led, and I showed in the film, to this idea that test scores were the way to rate our education. And so,
and again, that's still going on today when you talk about Great Schools website. I'm constantly talking to parents who are saying, oh yeah, I go there and I check out the score, but that doesn't really give you a reflective idea of what the school is like. So why are we so focused on the test scores and those outcomes?
Because we've been told to focus on it. That's why. Because there is an industry behind that. There are the testing companies.
Right.
There are new charter movements, fully funded by billionaires, who see that this $8 trillion industry, it's called education, which was primarily a public market, can be privatized.
It can be segmented and divided up.
We had Reagan with his, conservative, what is it, the libertarianism, but almost as destructive for me was the Clinton years that followed, where we were neoliberalists and we felt that the only solutions are market-driven solutions.
Or privatized.
That's right, privatization. So now we're in the 20th century suddenly, and we have this, act of No Child Left Behind, where we're going to say all children will be raised to a certain level. Well, there's not even a community in the United States where all children are equal in terms of their upbringing, their opportunity, their nutrition. So it's these blanked, radical, if you will, concepts of equality, but the system is inequitable, so that makes no sense. But we still penalize low-performing schools. Muir and most of PUSD, surrounded by primarily affluent communities.
Yeah, extremely affluent.
extremely affluent communities, and test scores correlate to socioeconomics of the family, not pretty regularly. I mean, it's a, and I'm not saying that poor people can't be good students. It's just poor people don't have the resources of extra tutoring, trips abroad, all the things that, for example, I can give my child, but I would never assume that the child next to him has to have had those same experiences. And what we learned during the years of desegregation is that lower performance students, if they're in school with higher performing students, do better. And the higher performing students don't do worse, right? So the only time of achievement gaps shrinking in the whole history of the United States were in communities that were desegregated.
Yeah, and in communities where you have a mix of not only ethnicity and culture, but economic and social demographics as well. So let's think a little bit about if you have this film. One thing you discussed earlier was narrative, and so how does a documentary change the public narrative? How do we get to the point where people actually are saying, one, the schools are not failing, and two, I actually see value in being in a classroom with people who are not like my kids?
Well, you just have to use your own story. I mean, that was the turning point for my film, where it became Stories of Integration to the Segregation of John Muir, was when, actually, it was a very unfortunate situation. Cameron Turner, who had always been sort of the center of voice of my film, he passed away before we had finished. So I was living overseas at the time, and I was thinking, well, where does the film go now? And I discovered a group called integratedschools.org, which was founded by a woman in Los Angeles who just recently passed away, who was saying, look, I'm a white privileged woman who lives in a community where nobody who's white and privileged sends their child to the local elementary school. It's 98% Latino. Yeah. And she said, well, then I'm not really part of the community, am I? So I'm going to do it. And the backlash she kept, she wrote stories about what she encountered, the resource hoarding of what happens when some white parents go to low-resourced, what they call world population schools. Suddenly the principal is talking to them only, but she's like, well, that's not right either. I'm an equal parent. My child is an equal student, regardless of the fact that he knows he's traveled or he has the opportunity to go to a tutor and the other child doesn't. That we all have to, if we're going to be good community members, we have to support the entire community and not only be looking out for ourselves. It was a very radical concept, but I spoke to her over the phone when I was overseas just before we moved back, and I realized that the story isn't just about the history of the school and the history of integration and desegregation in Pasadena, but what am I going to do as a parent? Am I going to be willing to send my child to this quote-unquote failing school? And so then I spent 6 months on the campus when I got back, really finding out what it would have been like, what would it be like, and how does that make me feel emotionally, and why and I don't really deal with it too much in the film because I think every parent has their own issues and fears and experience. But I can say with definitively that I'd be completely comfortable sending my son there. And I think if more people went to visit their local schools that they deem failing and look past these numbers associated by test scores, they're going to find really committed, experienced, excellent educators. And they're going to find that being in that environment where not everyone can afford lunch, or more importantly for me, I think in my experience, I grew up near 5 Acres and the Sycamores, these foster homes. So in every class I ever had, or on every bus I rode, there was a foster child, and just kind of understanding that, wow, I am really lucky, and recognizing that you're lucky, I think leads you to be a little more compassionate.
Well, I think that's one of the aspects of our society that oftentimes is forgotten, and that's gratitude. And this whole notion of, actually we do have it pretty darn good here, and we should be more appreciative of it and recognize it. What's interesting, and I know that you have ties to Disneyland, and so when I think about...
well, my marriage.
Right. Yeah, you should clarify that.
Yeah.
But if you go to Disneyland or you go to Dodger Stadium as an example, you see the whole world there. You see the rainbow of humanity at those places, and everybody apparently is getting along well enough that there's no outward sort of hostility or conflict. People are in a harmonious situation. Right. But that's just one level of interaction. It's fascinating that when you get to education, people are much more reticent, and I think it's driven a lot by that fear that you were talking about. And one of the fears is, how am I going to get the best, highest, greatest education for my child? And I don't want him or her to be dragged down by these other people.
Right, as if there's a chance that their peers are going to somehow affect them negatively in their grades. I'm not saying it's probably never happened, but I'll just use my family of 7 children. Growing up in what was considered an undesirable neighborhood. And there's, nobody's ever had drug or alcohol or been in jail issues. So that's a pretty good study group right there. That's a pretty good group. And we all had friends in the neighborhood pretty much. And so it's just, it's ridiculous to assume that you as a parent is less influential in your child's, upbringing than peers at a school.
Yeah, I just feel like we just touched the surface of all these topics.
Oh my God!
But we're wrapping up now.
No.
Just in closing, what would you want people to think about both the film and your work?
In terms of the film, I would love for people, especially people who live in Pasadena or Sierra Madre or in Altadena and part of the PUSD, because I do kind of go into how it was that the districts got imbalanced to begin with. And they can see it at www.getalongfilm.com, where it's on video on demand. And then otherwise, I'd like parents to start really thinking about their choices and how that affects the larger community schools overall, that they play a very important part in making everything better.
Great. Thank you so much for being on our show today.
Thank you,
it was a pleasure to have you. So
thank you.
And I look forward to seeing you at all the award ceremonies this spring.
Yeah. If you're there, have fun.